Welcome to everyone. I'm Lawrence Kermayer. I'm here at McGill in the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry. Welcome to people who are joining us both from our own community here in McGill, but also actually around the world. We're delighted to have you with us. This is our Thursday afternoon speaker series in the division, which actually runs along several different themes: global mental health, culture, mind and brain, culture and clinic, and culture and community mental health, I guess. So this is a talk that, as we'll hear, kind of crosses some of those rough divisions or streams. These occur most Thursdays from 3 to 5. So let us know if you'd like to be on the mailing list if you're not already. These talks are recorded because we edit them afterward, and with the approval of the speaker, post them, or will be posting them online, so people can make use of them in the future for teaching or reference. Usually the format, we'll hear more in a moment, but usually the format is a talk of somewhere around an hour, and then we have an hour for discussion. So, and that's often a very rewarding part of this. So I hope you'll all be with us through that. I expect there'll be a number of other people joining us, but I want to welcome our speaker and turn it over to Professor Vincent Liberté to introduce the speaker in the session today. So please, Vincent.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Welcome for this first talk of the Politics of Psychic Life speaker series that I'm organizing with Professor Samuele Colu. So we invite thinkers who have informed of understanding of the ways individual minds on the one hand and society, cultures, or even technologies co-influence each other's. And we are particularly interested in the urban context. Today, I'm very honored to present our speaker, Professor Tomas Matza, from the Department of Anthropology of the University of Pittsburgh. Among other things, Professor Matza has written an ethnography called Shock Therapy, Psychology, Precarity, and Well-Being in Post-Socialist Russia that I really enjoyed and recommend. In this book, Professor Matza shows how the way mental health and psychology, the kind of psychotherapies offered, and the politics and social context are interacting throughout Russia's transformation in the 20th century up to now. We will talk today about Russia, but also about his work in Salvador, during which he participated in a global health initiative aimed at improving children's development. So we have 2 hours. However, I said something more like 90 minutes to Professor Matza, so we'll see. We have 90 minutes up to 2 hours, depending on how it goes. And so without further ado, please welcome Professor Tomas Matza.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you so much. It is great to be here. I will start a screen share here. And oops, I want to make sure it's going in the right way. So can everyone see the slide, just the slide? Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm also going to hide myself, so I'll see a few more of you. Okay, so it is, as I said, it is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank especially Vincent for the invitation and Samuele as well. I've long admired a lot of the scholarship that has come out of both the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry and also the Department of Anthropology at McGill. And so it's a special thing for me to be able to come here and share my work with you. I also want to thank Paula for helping me get this set up and making it a very easy transition. I will talk for, well, we'll see how long it is. I'm hoping to keep it to 50. We were talking with Lawrence about the attention economy. I don't want to take too much of yours. And I agree that the Q&A is often the most satisfying. I'm actually hoping for dialogue rather than sort of dodgeball where I just answer questions. By that point, you will be tired of my voice, I think. So hopefully we can have some dialogue. Okay, so the title of this talk is Between Politics and Policy, Psychic Life as an Object of Intervention in Russia and El Salvador. And I will be drawing on ethnographic research which has been conducted in these two locations. I'll also say that this is the first time I'm presenting these two projects together. So this is a little bit experimental. And in that sense, then your critical comments and suggestions will be really appreciated. Okay, so I took very seriously Vincent's suggestion that this is a series about the politics of psychic life, and so that will be my entry into these materials. So let me get started here. Advance the slide. Great. Okay. So I'd like to sort of define some terms, or at least give some points of orientation. So psychic life, to me, I think it's a very open-ended and interesting rubric or lens. And so I thought I would just start by saying that the way that I'm going to be thinking about psychic life today is in terms of an object that is mediated, relational, and scaled. So mediation in the sense that we construct particular relationships to ourselves. We constitute ourselves as objects of inquiry and work. Relational in the sense that we are in relation with others who have similar relations to themselves. And together, those various levels of psychic life, the internal, the intersubjective, and the social are, of course, culturally mediated, politically mediated, socially organized. That means also that psychic life is a political terrain. And we know from many works that authoritative discourses and practices of therapeutics, which can range from psychotherapies to self-help programs to global mental health intervention, transform the terms by which people understand themselves and their relationships. And as such, therapeutics organize subjectivity and sociality, often in some positive relationship with power and structures of violence. So I think that's probably familiar to most of you, but that's maybe a bit of early framing. In my research then, I've asked questions that depart from this sort of basic understanding of the politics of psychic life. I've been really interested in how experts, for instance, therapists, work within, in opposition to, or in partial relation to political economic structures and related ideologies. Specifically, how do they conceive of healing, and what are the socio-political effects of their actions as healers? And it won't surprise many of you, but of course, psychotherapeutic encounters are places where political and psychological matters collide, and therefore where therapists navigate tensions between these as they engage with psychic life. All right, so that's framing. Here's what the talk is going to explore and the sort of terrain of this material. So the question I want to ask here is, what kinds of politics are the politics of psychic life? And how can answering that question help us to think about the political potentiality and also limits of therapeutics? So those are the two big questions. And I'll start by offering some departure point that answers the question, well, what do I mean by politics, first of all? And I'm using the notion of heuristics here, which I'll explain in a minute. After that, I will dive into my case studies from Russia and El Salvador, and then offer some summary conclusions. And in general, what I hope to show is the perspectives, experiences, and practices of my interlocutors in these two sites highlight the incredible political complexity of therapeutics. And I want to call for analyses that preserve two dimensions of therapeutics, the politics and policy, which I'll explain in a minute. And finally, explore how this complexity of therapeutics vis-a-vis politics can prompt us to ask new and interesting questions and explorations about what politics is or could be in fraught contexts, not only in the case of therapeutics, but I think in social life more generally. Okay, so heuristics. I'm using the term heuristics here in the sense of a method for problem solving, a way of looking, a lens. And in that sense, the framework of politics that I'm going to offer is experimental. So what I don't mean to suggest is the political theory of Jacques Rancière, who I'll be drawing on today, is in some way offering us a universally applicable theory of politics. This is something to think with. It's good to think with. And heuristic also here highlights the fact that this scholarship, this theory is situated as Black studies scholars have noted, for instance, Rancière is writing from a position of an unmarked white Frenchman. And so I think that by virtue of his positionality, there are particular aspects of politics that are foregrounded and other aspects that are backgrounded. So the point here is that we could use different ideas about what politics are and illuminate different aspects of therapeutics. All right, so politics. This comes from a very short and dense essay by Rancière called Politics, Identification and Subjectivation. And Rancière offers three concepts here that I find helpful. So the first is the political, and he defines the political as a space of encounter between policy and politics. So policy here would be processes of government, and politics would be processes of emancipation, the political being the sort of umbrella framework within which those encounters take place. As he writes in that essay, the political is the encounter between two heterogeneous processes. The first process is that of governing, and it entails creating community consent, which relies on the distribution of shares and the hierarchy of places and functions. I shall call this process policy. A crucial dimension of policy in his political theory is that power is also exercised through the distribution of the sensible. And for me, this is very reminiscent of Foucault's idea of grids of intelligibility, by which certain practices are rendered normal or natural and others are rendered abnormal or problematic. So there's a way in which policy has a very extensive effect over social fields and also in relation to subjectivities. The second process, as Rancière continues, is that of equality. It consists of a set of practices guided by the supposition that everyone is equal and by the attempt to verify this supposition. The proper name for this set of practices remains emancipation. And so what's important here for Rancière is emancipation is not a universal concept. It is a sort of empty set. It is something that is pursued in context situationally. And so in that sense, his political theory does not have a normative foundation. That's sort of one of the points. How he defines processes of emancipation are in relation to the righting of wrongs. Policies wrongs groups and individuals, politics rights those wrongs through coalitions and solidarities. Okay, so I've suggested in the title that the folks that I engage with in the field are between policy and politics. And in the context of this talk, I'm using the term politics or practices of emancipation or righting of wrongs in terms of how they are expressed through ethical practices, clinical work, consultations, self-help programs. And I'm using policy here or processes of rules in terms of how they are expressed through therapeutic rationalities, which can take shape of health policies, diagnostics, and also popular discourses, which create the distribution of the sensible along the lines, let's just say, of abnormality or normality, which is, going back to Margaret Mead and even before that, a crucial distinction, social distinction that has a lot to do with the psychiatric theory and practice. A small example might help here to illustrate the encounter between policy and politics in mental health. If we consider the development of new illness categories, for example, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, which your colleague Alan Young so nicely describes in his book, Harmony of Illusions. On these terms, sorry, I can't see my notes here. On Rancière's terms, the construction of the category is policy. Politics then would refer to the advocacy, for example, that veteran activists who agitate around this label as a way to make claims on healthcare institutions. And I guess in this example, we can also see how the terms of politics, in this case, laying claims on the basis of a particular diagnostic category, are infused with policy. So they're entangled. There's a looping effect between policy and politics in the sense that Ian Hacking writes about in his work. So the point then is that, of course, psychic life is a political and ethical field, which involves contestations between projects of rule and projects of emancipation, which affects clients and practitioners alike. And the key point for me as an ethnographer is that therapists, psychologists, self-help practitioners are effectively mediators between policy and politics, and they often serve two masters. So what I hope to show is that we can analyze their practices and learn a lot about how specific actors answer to these two masters. And I would hope to show in these case studies that their navigations have implications not only for how we map out the various ways that psychic life is a context for political encounter between policy and politics, but also what the implications are for those involved. How do everyday concerns such as developing healthy relations, feeling normally, reformulating emotional architectures, coming to terms with aspiration or attachment, well-being, how do all of those human aims and desires get worked out as objects of care and also government? All right, so now I'm going to move to the two case studies, and I will be reading some excerpts from these works, and I really hope that I've managed to get the timing correct here. It was hard to make choices. It's like you kind of want to brag about your stuff, and then you can't. You got to, like your children, and then you can only show a part of it. Okay, so I'll turn to these projects, and these I think are what I hope to show are specific contexts in which these the politics of psychic life can be seen. The first project took place from 2005 to 2013, roughly. The bulk of the research at the earlier side of that timing, and it engaged with the interrelations between psychology, power, subjectivity, and ethics in the context of post-socialist Russia. It was a very interesting time to be working there. It's always it's an interesting time to be working anywhere at any time, but it was particularly interesting to be working there. And I just want to acknowledge that this work builds on the scholarship of many other scholars in Russia studies, Nancy Rees, Michelle Rifkin-Fish, Julia Lerner, Eugene Reichel, who I know is a McGill alum. And outside of Russia studies, there are many others as well, Lisa Rofel, Li Zhang, and so forth. So what I was studying in this case were the transformations in Russian psychotherapy after the Soviet collapse. And for any of you who are interested in the social history of psychotherapy, it's a fascinating story that that you can learn about. I cover it in one chapter of my book, and there are others. For example, the scholarship of Lauren Graham, who talks about the way in which Soviet psychotherapy and psychology were configured. To give you a very brief overview, particularly under Stalin and then moving forward in time, psychiatry was organized by Marxist-Leninist materialism, which is to say that it was more brain than unconscious. Freud was, out as of the 1920s. Moreover, talk therapies were rather rare. For that reason, many Russians that I met, even in 2005, had an association between the prefix psy and pathology. So what's interesting then about what begins to happen in the 80s and accelerates in the 90s until today is the influx of new psychotherapeutic idioms, particularly Carl Rogers made a famous trip to Moscow and Tbilisi in the mid 1980s, and humanistic psychology, but also existential psychotherapy became very interesting and appealing therapeutic alternatives to the forms that had been instantiated under Soviet politics. Okay, so I wanted to study those transformations, and I wanted to ask, how were Russian psychological and psychotherapeutic institutions and practices reshaped during the market revolution? To what social and individual effect? My fieldwork involved more multi-sited ethnography, and I tried to track these transformations into a variety of institutions: commercial services for children and adults, municipal services for children. I did a lot of collected life histories of practitioners who were trained in the late Soviet period and then also in the post-Soviet period. And I wrote as well about how psychotherapy had infiltrated or had been, let's just say, taken up in both television talk shows and also radio talk shows. Okay, so I'm going to read now from this work, and what I want to give you a sense of is the policy side of this and then the politics side. Okay, so policy, this is from fieldwork I did in psychological education camps for children organized by a commercial entity, which I call Regeneration. And what I want to illustrate here are the policy aspects. Okay, so Regeneration's camps were places to learn how to be a kind of political subject. To train children in these new subjectivities, practitioners deployed a range of techniques, including the careful creation of atmosphere and self-constitution. Tamara specialized in the creation of social atmospheres and viewed their camps as a place to allow children to experience freedom and autonomy in the midst of different norms, expectations, and disciplinary forms. Specifically, ones she argued are still uncommon in Russian households. By invoking key words like autonomy, freedom, self-sufficiency, and individualism, she also implied a link between their efforts and what Barbara Cruikshank has called, quote, democracy, technologies of democratic citizenship. That is, discourses, programs, and other tactics aimed at making individuals politically active and capable of self-government, end quote. By couching these technologies in psychological languages, however, Tamara's goal was not so much political action as teaching a relation to oneself involving self-management, candor, confession, and, as Tamara indicated, even relaxation. On Monday morning, I joined Alexandra and Zhenya, two psychologists working there, in their lessons, and along with 8, 11 to 13-year-old children, I too became a feeling subject. During the week that followed, we were led from constituting and exploring interiority to intervening in it. These exercises often produced fascinating results. In one, we were handed a lump of clay and told to mold our deepest fear, with the idea that materialization would neutralize it. Gosha, obsessed with electronics, surprised me with his poetic sensibility, making a, quote, house without any doors or windows. Sasha, a brash 13-year-old jokester, made an animal claw that can expand and oppress, but also contract and disappear. As an expression of my own anxieties about social judgment, I made a little green man with a mean expression and an oversized finger pointing mockingly. Quiet Tolia made a green alien holding guns. And when he saw my little green man pointing and laughing at me, he said, Tomas, we are brothers. The lessons, drawing on a range of cognitive behavioral techniques, including positive reinforcement, role-playing, and rehearsal of past negative experiences, had armed us with emotional intelligence, giving us a range of tools to manage ourselves. To what ends? As diverse as the results that we produced were over that week, we spent very little time delving into the details. The point was to constitute a relation to self rather than to scrutinize differences. As Regeneration had promised in their promotional materials, we were being moved through the imperative of self-knowledge, or samopoznanie, to the management of self, samoupravlение. In light of the combined focus on competition and success, it was not simply self-management that was valorized, but self-management that would bring about a competitive advantage. For example, a discourse of success emerged in the final pages of our workbook. Several figures were presented for us to emulate now that we had developed the skills. All were famous athletes and were associated with short quotes about working hard, trusting in oneself, and achieving. One was from David Beckham. As he said, quote, Manchester's trainer played a huge role in our success. He inclined us toward winning, forced us to believe that we are the best. And so we really were. This link between succeeding and self-management was reinforced in the large gatherings that took place 3 times a day. And these were all organized by scorekeeping, friendly competition, and a range of individualizing practices that began the day the children arrived at the camp. This evaluative dynamic was tempered with, for me at the time, shocking permissiveness. What I saw was a kind of regime of rule breaking. Children could leave their seats and walk around, have side conversations, even taunt the psychologists. All that was expected was that they participate. When things went awry, psychologists rarely yelled. Instead, they modeled patient but firm interpersonal relations. And the camp's orientation to success, along with this emphasis on competition, individualization, and self-management, compelled me to see this work in relation to the circulation of neoliberal political rationalities, which are, as have been well described in many contexts and cases, premised on governing free individuals in context of privatization, individuals who are induced to self-manage according to market principles of discipline, efficiency, and competitiveness. I'll just say, I don't have time to get into it, but the work in the public context was quite different. And if this was about emotional management, achieving potential, and leader and success, the municipal contexts were underserved. And I would say it won't surprise any of you probably to hear that the orientation or the objectives and aims were quite different. The discourse of help was not about emotional fulfillment, but about managing broken psyches and working on concrete concerns about learning and cognitive function. So Psy and policy, Russia. I would say the crucial policy context to keep in mind here are of what's happening in the background. So there's been a market revolution. Regeneration is trying very hard to not only participate in, but also constitute a market for psychological services. They're trying to tap into and also produce certain kinds of parenting anxieties about what the future might hold for their children, and also promote the idea that psychological techniques or psychological education, as they called it, would be a very sensible, viable, and interesting thing to provide to their children, almost like taking a computer course. Another background here is the emergence of post-socialist inequity, sharpening of distinctions between socioeconomic class, and then Putin's ongoing efforts to modernize institutions while at the same time not providing tremendous funds for public services. So as I show in the book, in tracing the new Psi practices into these private and public institutions, it's possible to see how class differences become linked to different assumptions about psychological difference, capability, damage, the self as an object. And as such, psychologists and psychotherapists were implicated in the reproduction of inequity. How about politics, though? Here's another excerpt from the book, and I want to show a different side of these practices. In conversations with Regeneration staff, they offered me an alternate understanding of the motives and underlying psychological education. They were promoting a socially attuned and gender-sensitive empathy. Rather than producing young entrepreneurs, they were intervening in social relations by promoting tolerance and injecting new models of care into family life. Instead of cultivating an elite, they spoke of transforming that elite. As Tamara, the director, explained, quote, "We are creating an atmosphere where children have more freedom than they do at home, so they can find their own way, become more self-sufficient. The cultural norm in Russia until perestroika with regard to upbringing was very strict and directed. There are still multi-generational families living under one roof, and nobody learns to practice autonomy. Children get married, and then they move in with their parents. But things are starting to change for the better," she said, "like in Europe, where everyone is so free, all so relaxed. And now, finally, we are starting to relax. It's a form of individualism in the good sense of the word." Their claims to end quote. Their claims to social reform rested on an important foundation, a critical reading of both Soviet past and the post-Soviet elite. And for them, self-work was a response to historically rooted social problems whose contemporary manifestation lay in the elite's perceived callous attitudes and lack of concern for others. When I specifically asked Tamara about the fact that they were only reaching the children of the well-to-do, her response was striking. She said, "We hope to work with the 20% of Russians who will make decisions for the other 80%. This statement also suggested an important distinction, not just between segments of the population, but also between psychologist and client. I encountered it in another conversation when, responding to my request for access to clients' parents, Alexander demurred, "They have no interest in seeing us. We are their employees." This difference between we and they reveals contested power relations between the post-Soviet elite and the mass intelligentsia, that is teachers, doctors, engineers, and indeed psychologists. In the Soviet period, these professions enjoyed a certain material privilege while playing the role of moral standard bearers. And Patico and Rifkin-Fish have argued that as their material means disappeared in the 90s, all that remained for the intelligentsia was that role as a moral standard bearer. Affronted by the materialistic values of the so-called New Russians, the intelligentsia has struggled to maintain a place in the national imaginary and at the same time has issued frequent critiques of corruption linked to the new elite and of course also the Putin administration. In light of this, Tamara's targeting of that consequential 20% can be read as a civilizing project. long considered by the intelligentsia to lack manners and ethics. And this general civilizing concern took various forms, most often outside the group lessons, as I would learn. Alexander told me that Sasha, the one who made the claw that would retract and expand out of clay, Sasha loved to disrupt his own and other psychological education, but in fact, he had calmed down a lot since the first camp. And invoking the critical discourse of crass New Russians, Alexander painted a picture of home neglect, saying that Sasha, whose parents are divorced, almost never sees his mother, a high-powered executive, and spends most of his time with his grandmother. The psychologists have thus been helping Sasha to build sustained, trusting relationships with adults, rather than to respond to them with a defensive sarcasm, masking fear. Over time, Alexander, the psychologist, noted, psychologist has come to identify closely with him. As Tamara told me, many children begin living from camp to camp, identifying more strongly with camps than home. Point is that through these conversations, I began to see psychological education was also a form of self-work for the psychologists. While intervening in historical and contemporary problems by helping children develop their own self-management skills, they simultaneously constituted themselves as social reformers. If you're wondering about the public services portion of this, there were politics there as well, and they took the shape of exploiting institutional indeterminacies, finding ways to do end runs around the excessive bureaucratization of psychological care through the manipulation of paperwork, or just establishing and developing one-on-one relations with different kids who came into the center. So the takeaways of the Russia case that I want to leave you with are these two dimensions. So I hope to show that as policy, psychic life became a vehicle for the reproduction of elite neoliberal individualism. And as politics, psychic life became a vehicle for civilizing the elite via promoting empathy, autonomy, and psychosociality among children. Okay. So I'm going to turn now to project 2. And here I'll just say this work draws on and very much inspired by scholars doing work in global health and global mental health. To name a couple, Dr. Bem, Lawrence Kermeyer, Byron Good, Brandon Court, Vikram Patel, Derek Summerfield, scholars who write about metrics, Vincent Adams, Cal Baruch, Susan Erickson, and also critical medical anthropology, Meryl Singer, to name one of many, Julie Livingston, and so forth. So in this case, I was sort of pivoting to new questions. I was beginning to think about how psychological idioms circulate across boundaries, national boundaries in particular, through mental health interventions. There was a transnational dynamic to the Russia study in the sense that a lot of the idioms and theories were imports, but the practitioners themselves were Russians. So I became interested in cases where we have foreign interveners in contexts and in countries that are where they are not citizens. And so I wanted to explore in this particular case how a Euro-American NGO's psychosocial intervention into child caregiver relationships in El Salvador was shaped by the political economy of international assistance. And you can see a theme here is that I'm trying to always match political economy with therapeutics. That's the sort of intersection that particularly interests me. And so specifically, how did the NGOs hope to quantify and scale their project, dictate what care was? Okay, so a bit about context here. First of all, you may not know very much about El Salvador. It's a country in Central America. It was a site of a very brutal civil war from 1979 to 1992 between the US supported right-wing government and leftist guerrillas, the FMLN. The peace accords were signed in 1992. And since then, many have described the post-90s period as just an ongoing kind of silent war. There are very high rates of poverty. In 2014, 30% of the population was living in poverty. Neoliberal policies have narrowed economic opportunity, cut social spending, and refortified a national elite or an oligarchy, which was one of the reasons for the Civil War in the first place. There are also, as probably many of you have heard, unfortunately, this is one of the only things people do hear about El Salvador, as the gang crisis. So in 2013, famously, 3 years into the breakdown between a truce between the government and gangs, El Salvador had the highest homicide rate in the Western Hemisphere. As a result of this, then, many adolescents flee to the United States to avoid gang conscription, and 30% of young people do not attend secondary school. Last point that's interesting about this impact of youth is that many parents have also left to work in the United States, which contributes to what Wiltberger calls a developmentalist migration politics. In fact, national economic growth has become highly dependent on remittances. It's also, El Salvador has also been a target of a lot of international assistance, as many places in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala. Drawing on a citation from my colleague Kevin O'Neill, who's at UToronto, he notes that between 2009 and 2012, foreign governments and international institutions provided nearly $2 billion for so-called soft security projects. So the intervention then takes shape against this background, or in relation to these institutional and political economic configurations. So what was it? What were they trying to do? The heart of it was a psychosocial intervention, and the NGO, which I call Helping Hands, sought to improve Salvadoran children's well-being by retraining caregivers in its 200+ child welfare centers. To do so, they drew on child education theories, including attachment theory, an emphasis on haptics, or an attention to haptics, that is to say, kinds of tender touch, maintaining eye contact, providing some material support, and also restructuring staffing to make more stable caregiver-child relationships, which would then be constitutive of more secure attachments. That was the intervention. On top of that, they also wanted to evaluate their work, and there was a massive plan put in place to measure every aspect of this work, with the ambition that they would eventually be able to develop a metric and an evidence-based best practice that could be deployed elsewhere. Okay. My fieldwork took place in a variety of locations. I did research among the NGO staff and social scientists over Skype, out of country, in English. I also needed to coordinate a team of ethnographers, so I experimented a little bit with collaborative research. I'm still trying to sort through that and what that means for ethnography. And did some participant observation of my own in child welfare centers as my language competency improved, which I will also say it's still not great in terms of Spanish. So that has been a limit, putting me in the same position as the helicopter interveners that I was also engaging with. Okay. I'm getting worried about time here, but let's just see how it goes. Policy then, using the same sort of back and forth here. So what was the policy piece of this? So So child poverty was the primary concern cited in Helping Hands documents. And I'm calling this turning qualities into quantities with reference specifically to the effects of metrics on the way that they thought about doing intervention, and also what the investment in producing metrics, what effects that then had on their ability to do the intervention. So their intervention, as I said, was animated by a longer term aim. By reaching children at an early stage of development and providing them with a secure attachment for a portion of the day, they argue that their work would contribute to violence reduction. And this possible payoff, linking psychosocial health to youth violence prevention, positioned Helping Hands squarely within a core concern of the Salvadoran government, US hemispheric security policy, and international funders. They hope to do this by transforming caregiver-child relationships, and they planned a 9-month cycle of trainings, which would take place once a month, offering information about structuring staffing, promoting freedom of movement, unstructured play, and also how to interact with children to create appropriate attachments. I had already been hearing about the centers for a while from the team's field notes. Eugenia Zavaleta, Jackie Duran, Grazia Grimaldi, Melissa Rivas, and Yesenia Alvarez, who deserve mention because they are fantastic ethnographers, all of whom have gone on to bigger and brighter things. In 2015 of July, I then made my first personal visit, and I saw a variety of centers, urban, rural, calm, chaotic, very rustic, concrete walls on the other hand. But I want to share with you one visit that I had with Jacqueline Duran, who had been doing research there in a small coastal place. The center was perched alongside a mangrove estuary, and Margarita and Angeles, the educadoras there, had arranged a tour. And ahead of time, Jackie had told me to bring boots. I soon understood why. And as we one by one sort of walked into this estuary, and this sort of flush of warm seawater just slurped right down into my boots. The scene ahead, though, was strange and beautiful. The pathway was tree-lined and inviting, but also a little bit surreal. Homes of bamboo and tin atop makeshift foundations of mud and tires built to keep the water at bay peeked out from amid the mangroves. Margarita identified the homes of children attending the center, and we stopped at one just 2 feet above the rising water. A woman in her 60s greeted us. She explained that twice a day, when the tide rolls in, the house floods with seawater and debris. The younger children, unable to swim, are put in a secure room until the tide ebbs. And when Angeles makes these rounds each morning to pick up the center's children, she sometimes needs to coax. Parents prefer to keep their kids at home to help work, to collect crabs, to sell at the market. We also learned that gang violence had made life particularly difficult there. For example, in the pickup on the way to town, I saw Jackie pointed out some graffiti. Ver oír y callar, see, hear, and be silent. The community straddles a boundary between Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, two gangs, and violent disputes often spill into the community and even the care centers. In the team's ethnographic documentation as a whole, they also found that there was a lot of trauma still from the Civil War. They documented that a lot of the educadoras hoped for material support, something that was not exactly in this Helping Hands plans. And they were also not being paid or receiving their food allowance for a period of months. So what I want to say here is that these hardships were the context of care, yet they seemed beyond the reach of the metrics that Helping Hands was relying on to know if their work made a difference. Additionally, I wondered how much difference their intervention, which revolved around these 9 one-day trainings, could really make. for me as an anthropologist, we're very good at finding trouble, as people say. What's the famous saying? Find me an anthropologist and I'll show you problems you didn't know you had. It was easy for me to imagine all the ways that things would turn out differently. In seeking to contextualize caregiving ethnographically, our team was continually pulled beyond the caregiver-child dyad and toward the children, the conditions under which the educadoras worked, the home life of the children, the economic precarity, the gang situation in the community. There was a potential danger also in the intervention's working model. In addition to crashing on the rocks of structural violence, I worried that there was a risk that by isolating this dyad as the target, the caregivers themselves would bear blame for any lack of improved well-being. So the political economic context here, a transnational security scape, post-Civil War, a variety of humanitarian reason that revolves around evidence-based metrics, quantification, monitoring, and evaluation. This is what the NGO had to contend with. And so the effect of this, I want to suggest, is that quantification, scale, and modularity risked obscuring a variety of structural issues affecting care. That's because in the face of these various factors shaping child well-being, the NGO, they actually needed to find something tangible, measurable, and doable. And that something was this dyad, which, as ethnographics showed, was a small part of a much wider and more complex social reality. Politics. I'm 46 minutes in.
Yeah, it's okay. You can continue. Maybe let's try to have 15 minutes max, more.
You say 15?
15 minutes.
Okay, no problem.
Max, because if we have 2 hours, you know, we can let this presentation go
Perfect.
on.
Thank you. I can definitely, probably sooner than that, I think. Thank you. This is the last excerpt I will read. So I think we'll move a little more fluidly after, or less fluidly, actually, is usually the case. Okay, so excerpt 4, politics. And here I want to think about scaling and shaping care, and the way that Helping Hands, in light of the context in which they operated, I want to think a little bit about what the politics of the intervention as a process of emancipation, how might we think of it in those terms? So they really wanted to develop an intervention that would not only be successful in El Salvador, but also in other countries. And to do this, as sort of dictated by this contexts, global contexts, they needed to use a rigorous randomized procedure to demonstrate a positive outcome that could be attributed to the intervention, not noise. And they needed, in other words, the label evidence-based best practice. I will add that this was only one facet of a much broader global aim, which in my reading was an effort to really make efficient use of these funds, take advantage of the opportunity that they had been given to do this work. So they also wanted to transform how care is measured. Sarah, Helping Hands director, explained that the currently used metrics placed too much emphasis on infrastructure, running water, Western toilets. So such numbers often resulted in low scores, where the care itself may actually be quite good. When scores stand in for social realities, she observed, they also have the power to channel funds, and unfortunately often in the wrong directions, repainting walls, providing toys or play structures, to the complete neglect of the kinds of care that's happening in those spaces. So by developing their own metric, they hope to create a different way of surfacing and intervening in the quality of care. If successful, their tool also had the potential to redefine not just the landscape of global measurement, but also the funding streams that flow from international agencies to future projects like these. So the ambition was far-reaching and indeed global. Underlying that, though, was the immediate task of training those educadoras. And at an early meeting, Fred, the PI of the evaluation, introduced the project to an assorted team of quantitative surveyors. Speaking through a translator, he explained, "We try to find cost-effective means of improving policy. We don't know if Helping Hand's intervention will work. We like Helping Hand, and we like their intervention. If their approach works, we want to also know which pieces work. It's really exciting that your government wants to try to standardize childcare. At the moment, there's no formal assessment, very little training for caregivers, and very different kinds of physical and emotional environments for childcare. The work that we all do will help to create these missing pieces." End quote. In the evaluator training that day, also, Helping Hands demonstrated a sensitivity to cultural appropriateness. They ran through bit by bit their metric and asked the evaluators to comment on the questions. Laura, a trainee, said that on the household survey, the use of the word simple in the sense of imitates simple adult movements should be changed because it can have negative connotations for parents. So in the coming months, though, what I saw is that the project began to balloon. Fred, the PI, the evaluator, drew on statistical power calculations and plan to randomize centers to do the work in just 60 centers. But Sarah, thinking ahead to this political economy of assistance, wanted to add more research questions. Could they train indirectly, train a small group who would then train more? That would be more cost effective. Would it be possible to measure the effects of just providing materials in centers versus intervening in care? Could we compare the presence or absence of additional technical assistance after the training take place? Evidentiary needs grew. And with some 7 variables to measure, the power calculations soon drew all of the centers into the study. And these new questions pointed to an expanding, rigorous engagement with the political economy of evidence. They also indicated Helping Hand's keen intention to leverage the intervention to make a case for work elsewhere. By the summer of 2015, the wheels were finally in motion. Evaluators and ethnographers were fanning out across the country to gather baseline data. Because of security concerns, they had also taken on the cost of and logistics of transporting their evaluators daily. And then, just as the actual caregiver trainings were underway, funding rumors began, and the other shoe dropped soon enough. In 1 month, the 30 evaluators were let go. The training they received, the full intervention was put on the back burner, and only a fraction of the centers would receive training while Helping Hands sought more funds elsewhere. Sarah, the director, stopped paying herself and let key staff members go. The educadoras I met later on when I went back did ask what happened, but it was interesting that when I told them, they didn't seem that surprised. They had seen many NGOs come and go. So some takeaways. So as policy, I was trying to show how psychic life had been reified as a number and then turned into an intervention target in a political economy of international assistance. And the risk here was that the approach would obfuscate the structural and political conditions already negatively affecting child well-being. As politics, though, I want to emphasize that these academics and NGO directors, humanitarian agencies were engaging critically with the logic of numbers and using quality of care rather than infrastructure as an index. They really hope to improve the way that other institutions understand children's well-being while making a difference in El Salvador. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully get to the end here quickly. Conclusion. So what kinds of politics are the politics of psychic life? And how can answering that question help us to think about the political potentiality and limits of therapeutics? If we recall Rancière, the political describes a context or field of encounter between projects and politics. Policy wrongs equality, and I shall take the political to be the place where the verification of equality is obliged to turn into the handling of a wrong. I tried to show how the betweenness of politics and policy and demonstrate the doubleness of both of these sets of therapeutics, if we use that term very broadly, serving two masters, institutions, while also seeking to intervene in ways that I think we could read accurately as efforts to right certain wrongs. Let's see. Let me address this in the Q&A. This is about how there are other heuristics that could reveal other things about this work. And I will come back to the, I've just indexed here anti-psychiatry writings, Zaz, Lang, Foucault, Goffman, ... Also, I was engaging a bit with Black political philosophy, the writings of Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, and there's a really interesting article by Nick Brommel about the limitations of Rancière's framework from the perspective of Black political philosophy. Also, I can come back to Lynn Layton and her idea of nonconformist clinical practice. All of these, I think, cast the work that I was engaging with, I think, in different terms. Okay. So what kind of politics is this and what kind of emancipation? Here, policy and politics are clearly not antithetical to one another in therapeutics. Indeed, policy is one of the infrastructures of politics. Therapeutics are institutionally imbricated, always potentially co-opted, partial. But in some way also they are concerned with righting a wrong in Rancière's sense, and then in that sense, a bit emancipatory. But this is a politics of compromise where emancipation is pragmatic, it seems, rather than radical. So what? Who cares? Why carefully tease apart these processes of policy and politics of psychic life? There are a couple of reasons that I wanted to share. I think one is ethical, an ethical research practice. So my interlocutors in Russia and El Salvador really felt they were working to make a difference. So what would it mean to ignore those claims as an anthropologist? I think also there are ethnographic and political reasons. I think we need concepts that not only help us to understand these kinds of practices as politics or as a certain kind of politics, but more importantly, to diagnose them as such while identifying limitations. So my concluding thoughts are that I hope I've shown you that exploring the therapeutic practices as in between policy and politics is a productive activity, that it opens a possibility to assess interventions while suspending binary readings of those practices as either apolitical healing, which I think is one problem, or else as a hyper-political version of subjugation. I think it allows also for analyses of the politics of psychic life as something that is person-centered and involves a situated encounter. And I do think there are possibilities in thinking in this in-between way to also critically highlight the limitations of therapeutics as a politics of emancipation. That is all. Thank you, Vincent, Samuele, McGill. Thank you to my Russian, Salvadoran, and NGO colleagues for their generosity and time. Fulbright Hayes, SSRC, Pitt, CRDF also provided support for this, and also thanks to you very much for your attention and for being here. Sorry for going a bit long.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Perhaps we can close the PowerPoint, and you're welcome to open your camera if you want to be seen in this circle of discussion.
Let me just give me 1 second here. There it is. There it is. Okay.
Okay, and also thank you for taking so seriously the concept of politics of psychic life and making it at the center of your presentation. It was generous. So now it's the time for the discussion period, and we have some time. Um, and perhaps I can open the discussion. I'll try to ask a question, Thomas, that cross both field side. Um, um, I wonder if there's similarity in the configuration that you have drawn in Russia and in Salvador. Um, in terms of Russia, I'm talking in the socialist period that you describe in your book, in which there was one simple theory that was Pavlovian, one behavioral intervention, and then there was an attempt to completely neutralize the social aspect of disease because the totalitarian regime was perfect. And when you talk about the work in Salvador, I also see one behavioral intervention, one simple theory, and an attempt to neutralize the social context that you describe in ethnography. And I wonder if it's just a scale effect when you try to act on the whole population level, that's what happened, or if there's something else there that perhaps you have some insight about.
Great question. Thank you. And I wanted to say that I think this Q&A can be hopefully dialogic because I've talked so much already. So I'm really interested in other people also contributing to the answers, not just to the questions. And this one, I suppose I'm on the hook. And I would say that's fascinating, Vincent. That's a great question. And I love the way you've opened up the possibility to find an interface here around this phrase, as you put it, the eradication of the social. You said, is that an effect of scale, a scale effect? Yes, but not only, I would say. I would say that my reading of the historiography of Soviet psychiatry suggests that that was actually a very ideological commitment, which was driven by the idea that as socialism was being constructed, social neuroses ought to have been eradicated. Moreover, plumbing the depths of the Freudian unconscious was a sort of bourgeois residue and thing to do. It was a form of subjectivity that was made very problematic in the 30s, and which, if we take the Freudianism, only returns in a certain form in the 70s. So so that would be the ideological story of the eclipsing of the social in that context. El Salvador, I think we can find ideological reasons to eclipse the social under global capitalism as well. And so many anthropologists have written about the fact that psychology, but not only psychology, also a variety of interventions, humanitarian interventions, tend always to center, let's just say, sentiments or sort of charitable sentiments, ways of helping that often occlude the kinds of hard and disruptive work that would be necessary, for example, to promote more economic equality, to undo unfair free trade practices. So there are, and that's interesting that we can find ideological similarities on both sides of the Cold War, so to speak. And in both cases, related, albeit sort of different stories of the occlusion or eradication of the social.
Thank you.
So I have an ill-formed question, and yeah, we'll see where it goes. You know, you're drawing on this distinction and this contrast between politics and policy, and it's a way of framing some kind of social dynamics that can occur in terms of a push and pull. At the same time, the therapies, insofar as they involve a person looking at themselves and their predicament, even if they don't privilege a great sense of interiority, you know, which is one of the things that psychoanalysis offered, was this sense of an inner theater that's very capacious, and you can spend a lot of time populating it and working with it. But even if they don't do that, if they still focus on individual suffering and the predicament of that person, they create a space for certain kinds of moral claims and certain kinds of self-reflection. And that maybe speaks to this idea of emancipation, but an interior aspect of emancipation. So my question is a very psychological question in a way. What corresponds, what are the internal dynamics that correspond to some kind of tension between ways of being that parallels the external dynamics? In other words, without sort of answering it myself, because I'm very curious to see where you'll take it. We encourage people in therapy to think about themselves as having options, as having mobility, as there being a value to how they live out their lives, and then trying to support some degree of agency, if not on a larger scale, at least in their local world. Mm-hmm. So how does that play out in the context that you're talking about internally for people, where they're faced with huge restrictions, huge constraints? I mean, thinking of the Russian setting. I guess I'm also very influenced right now at this very moment of what's going on in Russia at this very moment, mm-hmm. and how much even this history that you're recounting plays a role in people feeling at this moment that they have some power to protest, that they have both a value basis, an ethical basis for making certain claims, and maybe a degree of agency, even though it may land them in prison very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Lawrence. And so by internal dynamics, would it be fair to, if I could rephrase that in a maybe clunky way of saying it's a mode of relating to oneself, sort of mm-hmm. that okay. So what's that side of therapeutics in a politics sense, right? Not in a policy sense.
Yeah, and just take it one step further. It could be relating to oneself, or it could actually be configuring oneself. In other words, what do we mean by self? Because right. Our psychological models are very heavily written by a narrow range of those possibilities, but in fact, people live out, other and more complex possibilities, I think, that right. are not necessarily well described in current therapies.
Yeah. Yes. So I think I have a bit more to say about this from the Russia work, which was longer term. But what was so striking to me about talking with a lot of psychologists primarily about what it was that drew them into that kind of work in the first place. I think this gets at the internal dynamics. I'm thinking of one woman who had been a sort of black sheep schoolgirl who was very disciplined by her teachers and felt that she was kind of a big nobody. What was sort of shocking to her was, for example, coming into a room with others and being able to speak nati, sort of on a informal you dimension, to think of her, so a form of stranger relationality, that's intersubjective. The intrasubjective, I think, has to do with forms of internal harmony. Harmony was a word that I heard a lot, garmonia. Also channeling social energies inward in harmonious ways. Dusha, another idiom of soul, which is a very long, multiple centuries long history in Russia, was something that also became configured as part of the self. And all of these ways of configuring and relating to selfhood it was hard to ignore the emancipatory dimensions of them, while at the same time the other voice says, well, these are also very familiar forms of liberalism, political liberalism. So a certain way of valuing yourself, self-esteem was another really big one. So, but I don't want to jump to policy. I'll just stay with politics. It was very compelling to me to hear how people became happier, how they became more fulfilled, how their relations with others improved. They formed what I refer to as psychosociality, also in the book. Does that kind of get it? What you were thinking about? Yeah. Salvador, harder to answer. I spent less time talking with the caregivers, but I would say that those that went through the trainings found it extremely useful, actually. They brought home these new, and the term respectful was a word that Helping Hands used, not necessarily them, but these new, more respectful ways of valuing the child in the home, seeing their children as individuals, as fully fledged individuals. What had a big transformative effect on their social, on at least a few of them and their social relations. And I would say that has a, to the degree that we configure ourselves as parents, I suppose there are some internal dynamics there too.
Yeah, I think very powerfully so. It's not the kind of ethnography you did, but you can imagine doing experience near ethnography in which people talk about how looking at their child differently is making them think about their own childhood differently, or making them feel differently about themselves and their own, persistent, vulnerable, childlike moments of experience and so on. That's kind of what I'm getting at in terms of that there's some kind of a mirror. I'm posing it to you ironically because our position within, the Department of Psychiatry is always where everybody's already focused a lot on individual psychology, is always insisting on the outer, origins and reflections of all this stuff. At the same time, when you talk about the outer, thing, it is also, there's a parallel thing going on, or complicated things going on that might teach us something about, ways of being.
Yeah.
So,
It's interesting. So I think we're both pointing in similar directions, from the in out, but I've really come to appreciate and respect, I guess, phenomenological approaches to these kinds of studies. And I think that if we talk about obfuscations, I would also add that the term politics of psychic life can obfuscate, or the social components of psychic life, or at least it makes it difficult, I think, to address those kinds of experiential qualities and experience and modes of being. Thinking of Jason through.
I think what it does is by calling it a politics, it forces you to recognize that the individual's embedded in these larger structures of power and possibility, but how people inhabit those, and that's where you need the experience near phenomenological thing, because people are going to habit those in all kinds of ways, resisting, improvising, trying to turn things upside down with limited scope, because there may be consequences if they do. First of all, they need a niche and resources within which to do it, both personal and material resources. But there may be consequences if they push too far. And again, I'm thinking of the present moment, and actually, El Salvador too, of course, a place that had tremendous strictures on what people could say and do at certain moments in time.
Yeah, it's something I would like to get into more. I think I'm a bit of moth to a flame when it comes to, placing these kinds of inquiries in the context of political economy. But, I'm interested in these kinds of questions you're raising very much, even though they haven't been at the center of my work. I see them as really
Because I
important.
think it's
valuable.
another way to look at political economy, and those are overriding,
Yes.
over determining people's
True.
experience. But within it, some configurations allow people more scope for play, more scope for self-invention, more, and that has to be part of the equation, not just a sort of, crude, whatever economic man kind of account of things.
Yes, it's true. It's true. I would say that methodologically and maybe also descriptively, it's difficult. I mean, I think to find the traces of capitalism in internal dynamics it's hard. It's hard to write that way, I think, without falling into the, either an economic man type of scenario, or a way in which, you collapse into the same list of behaviors and concepts that Nicholas Rose, repeats over and over in his work, sort of the entrepreneurial self, responsibilization, prudentialism. Aha, there it is. So, but if you have suggestions about people that you think are doing that compellingly, I would welcome it.
Okay, I'll have to think about it some more, but we can come back to it. Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we can take some more questions. Oh, yes.
Hi, if I may
yeah.
jump in. Thank you so much. This was really an amazing, extraordinary seminar and
Thank
covered
you.
so much ground. I have two different sets of questions. I think one was really kind of dovetailing nicely with what Lawrence just mentioned, and as you as well, that if you notice the a sort of a configuration of the political in the Russian context where, as far as I know about the situation there in terms of a disciplining mother state and that kind of figure of the mother nation vis-a-vis the childlike traits in the individual. And I'm obviously using or kind of enforcing that sort of Freudian split to actually foreground that conversation. So that's actually a question about your field work there. Then the other one, I'm a bit puzzled or potentially even kind of concerned about the way in which we're using some concepts. And I do my own mea culpa in there as well, but like the ideas of liberalism, capitalism, socialism, those are really big terms that without being, further specified or contextualized in different places, they can mean a lot of things. And my particular concern is with the use of emancipation as the other face of those kinds of things. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on how you conceptualize emancipation. And I'm actually thinking also about how emancipation is, for example, construed in the context of Central America, because there's a particular theory of emancipation that is used in Latin and Central America in that regard that taps directly into questions of political economy. And then finally, because I'm also an ethnographer and I'm really interested in questions of positionality that you raised right at the beginning, in relation to Rancière and his concept of the political, etc. I wonder how, if you could share a bit more about your own positionality in relation to these sites and the different textures of these sites. And I'll leave it at that. I know these are really big questions, so just answer what you can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for those. Angela, am I seeing your name?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you, Angela. Let's see, I'll start with positionality. And I feel very, it was problematic to exclude this. I had a series of slides about my positionality. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that specifically, because I think it's really important for the ways in which I was seen in both contexts. And maybe I can then connect to the other questions as well through that. So I think that on the slide that I was going to show, I was going to highlight a couple of things that were important. So one is that I was researching and also writing as a cisgendered white male, an American citizen with Finnish citizenship as well, also Jewish ancestry, and of course as an anthropologist. In the Russian case, I was working in general in a context in which there's a sort of very traditional gender norms. It's a lot of heteronormative spaces, much more so than one might find in the United States. And this was evident in the ways in which a lot of the therapists talked about the work that they were doing. I was read as such, and I think my Americanness also gave me a certain ability to just stumble into places and ask questions, have inquiries. My American researcherness, my U.S. citizenshipness stirred suspicions that I was a spy. And my friend Anatoly asked me jokingly, but I think he kind of meant it too, Tomas, ty špion. I think also gender was very important here because the majority of my interlocutors were women. Not all, but particularly in the public services. And so there were, I think, things that I was able to talk about and explore with them, locations and sites where we could have conversations, and other things that were just not appropriate. You know, house visitations and things like that, I think were less common and less frequent. And the last thing that was important was I was a new parent. My partner and I were there with our 5-month-old son, and this was incredibly profound in the way that it shaped both the kinds of things I paid attention to in the field. You know, the project ended up being largely about children and psychologists working with children. But it also, I think, humanized me in a way to the people that I met when they saw me kind of, you know, doing things wrong, you know, vis-a-vis the sort of Russian traditions of upbringing. And I can't tell you how many babushki, Russian grandmothers, just like told me what was up on the subway, you know, in the middle of, you know, whatever was going on. I was always doing something wrong. So I guess and Jewishness too. Many of these, especially the late Soviet psychiatrists, were also Jewish by passport, as they called it. And so this was something that we shared, I think, that facilitated some conversations with them that may not have otherwise been possible. I will just also say the last thing about race, and this pertains to the use of rancière, right? So I mentioned the essay by Nick Brommel, where he brings Du Bois and other Black political theorists into dialogue with rancière. What that encounter shows is that rancière is writing about subjects, and I'm also talking about subjects. This is an unmarked category. Rancière is writing as an unmarked, but actually white Frenchman. And in Russia, and I would extend this to El Salvador, I think my whiteness, even though I haven't sort of thought it through enough yet in this work, where it certainly didn't talk about it at all today, was consequential in both access and also blindness, I would say, when I was writing early on. So I wasn't paying as much attention to the way that, for example, Central Asians are racialized in the Russian case. And there were cases about Central Asians that came up in which they were talked about in very problematic ways. They were not, I mean, I noticed them, but they didn't become central to the work. So race as a category or as an analytic was perhaps not centered, and that might be a result of my positionality. Salvador, sorry, I'm going on a bit on too long maybe on this. This is why I didn't include it, because you know, it gets it's so important. But
I think it's very helpful for everyone. So please feel
okay.
It's, you know, very
okay, thank you, thank you. This is a super racialized situation in which I, as a representative, kind of in some awkward relationship to an NGO, in a context where international agencies have a long and in many cases very problematic track record of doing things in this part of the world, I think that I was seen as part of that. And in the same way that opens up certain kinds of possibilities to enter ministries and talk to ministers, I think that it also foreclosed some possibilities to engage with other groups of people, particularly young people who you know, were already criminalized and targeted by both the police, but also in many cases the NGO. Let me see, did I have anything else I wanted to add about that? Those are, I could say more probably, but I have more to say about Russia because I spent more time there. In terms of emancipation, tell me what you are thinking, because I would love to. Are you thinking of liberation theology or? Yeah.
As well, yeah. Marxist theories of liberation and a particular Central American approach to emancipation.
Right.
Vis-a-vis hegemony, which, encompasses a lot of stuff, but is symbolically and semantically quite different from all the figures of capitalism, neoliberalism, and all those other isms that we just talked about, right?
Yeah.
Because then you could talk about US hegemony as a particular kind of politics in that sense.
Right. Yeah.
Hegemonic politics. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if it's too big of a question and you don't want to go down that route or rabbit hole, feel free to.
It's a big one. I'll just say that on emancipation, I think this, in the same way that Rancière, I'll start with that, is sort of blind to the positionality of identities of those who engage in politics by using terms like subjects. I mean, it's intentional for him, I think, to think about frameworks that would be sort of beyond specificity, but in doing that, there's this obscuring of political experience and suffering, for example, related to anti-Black racism, which is something that we're all thinking a lot about and need to be thinking more about. But emancipation for Rancière is a righting of a wrong, as he says. I think he very intentionally wants to avoid giving a normative foundation to what politics is. And that comes with some analytic potentials and I think also some limitations, particularly if you are acting or doing politics from a position with very distinct histories of oppression and marginalization. I think a normative foundation is quite necessary and helpful in that case. So I take your provocation on that score really seriously and would want to think a bit more carefully about the work that this framework does in relation to these materials. I think there are ways to go that could try to conceive of politics in more emic terms. In Salvador and also in Russia, and certainly avoid using these isms. It's a shorthand, but it's very fraught. And I'm assuming that the use of the term socialism with regard to Soviet communism has a way then of casting or conflating a variety of leftist projects into a particular Cold War binary, which is not very helpful, I would agree.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on something in that and the notion of emancipation, because the language of emancipation sort of implies, you're in chains or you're confined in some way, you're in an abusive relationship or you're in mind-forged manacles, and we're going to get you out of them. We're going to reduce them somehow. Where you go from there, what that actually means is somehow, like you say, for Rancière, it's not important. The important part is you're being liberated. You don't have to specify where it's going to go. And yet, in reality, you do. There's always that normative structure. Again, I'm thinking in the micropolitics of therapy and where, we have certain normative ideas of where a person should be, could be in their life, and we're trying to nudge them in that direction. And it's not just that it'll be good if your husband stops beating you all the time. It'll be good if you have agency, and the way you're going to express that agency is by doing certain kinds of things, certain families of things you could be doing. So I do think it's important to think of it, even though the language implies and it tries to evade maybe tough questions about, well, where's this heading and what does it require to actually get there, by just saying, look, we have a much simpler project. We just want, less domestic violence, or we want the child to be able to, learn and not be in tumult because of their family pain, which is fair enough. And we do think that way all the time, but it's partly by assuming a normative structure, let's say, that's already going to answer the question. So where do you go with this? Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm just saying that if you take that seriously, then you have to look at not just this moment of liberation or emancipation, that gives you more scope, but what that could be used for, how that could be lived out in any ongoing way for people.
Yeah.
And I think that happens in therapy. We give people a different way of thinking about themselves. They have to have people around them for whom that way of thinking about themselves is intelligible and workable in some ways, or they
Right.
actually get into trouble with therapies. Like therapy opened up an option for you, and now you don't know what the heck to do with it, and it's just creating new problems for you with the people
Yeah.
around you.
Yeah. Unless the people around you are toxic, in which case that can be a different kind of outcome. I heard that from one woman in Russia, Marina, I think I call her in the book, who talked so enthusiastically. I mean, it was a life-saving engagement for her to go into this psychotherapy institute, and she realized through that one of the outcomes was that the people around her were telling her what she was doing was problematic or wrong. But I hear you on the larger point that what is the telos of emancipation or therapy?
Yeah, so take an extreme example to go back to Wilhelm Reich and that sort of early chapter in a very liberatory view, a political view indeed of therapy, where the notion was almost like, you know, Freud's civilization and its discontents, that the consequence will be people who can live out their animal vitality or their orgone energy or whatever, their passion.
Right.
In some ways it'll be, and that has a whole history, a whole you know, Marxist socialist history in terms of Marcuse and you know, many chapters in that. And I think even though maybe it's like a done deal, it's interesting to maybe contrast that in some ways with, you know, the neoliberal chains that are a bit subtler and a bit stickier that people are trying to get themselves out of.
Yeah, I think that in this sense, if I can say quickly, I think it could be useful also to kind of distinguish more clearly what type of techniques and which type of models, because, you know, talking about, you know, the psychology, the psych disciplines, but like, as you said, you know, doing Deleuzian schizoanalysis or doing a psychedelic, you know, assisted therapy, or doing 15 years of Lacanian psychoanalysis, like different techniques also address different types of subjectivities, address/shape different types of subjectivity that are somehow then inserted in different cosmologies and activate different values. And so I think that because, you know, even in El Salvador, you were talking about attachment theory, and the subject addressed in attachment theory is not the same one addressed in cognitive behavioral therapy. And they plug in different values, systems, social spaces, imaginaries. And I think that they understanding also different techniques and what is the telos that is within that technique is also important, because they're very different, you know. Schizoanalysis and cognitive behavioral therapy are not shaping and addressing the same subject.
Just as a total aside, and really it's backward looking, but if anyone has not seen the film W.R. Mysteries of the Organism, which is a kind of biographical quasi-documentary about Wilhelm Reich, but plays off against the whole interplay between Yugoslavian and Russian communism and the political tensions, and very connected to sexual liberation in the 60s. And, you know, so it plays with all of this stuff and this Reichian theme of a kind of emancipation, liberation that's understood very much in physical and psychosexual terms rather than in political or theological terms.
W.R. Mysteries of the Organism.
Organism. Yeah, it does talk about, I mean, there's orgone boxes, and there's a connection to Alexander Lowen and other people doing sort of primal scream therapy, and, you know, various versions of these things that appeared in North America that are part of that lineage.
Cool.
So, and book burnings by the Food and Drug Administration in 1958 that occurred in New Jersey or whatever, of Reich's books. So that's a little, you know, shocking to see American book burnings is not what you usually think of. So
I mean, as you both the last comments and also Samuele's, I mean, I think that there is I will admit to a breadth and lack of depth in the ways in which I am engaging with the psychiatric, psychological, or psychotherapeutic, particularly in Russia. I think in El Salvador, the object is a little more narrow, and so I have done more thinking about attachment therapy and how that is it's interesting that that is the vehicle for intervention, because it has this very interesting history going back to Bowlby's studies of orphans in another post-war context. So I think those are, I've looked more into that, but I appreciate the call, the flagging of all of these intricate and important histories. You know, you could take any particular sort of theoretical orientation and just do that, you know, ethnographically. And I think that that would be that could be a next project, you know. Oh, but I know what I was going to say. I tried to something I have coming out that does a little bit better job with that is I've been learning a little bit about Carl Rogers' visit and the way in which sort of humanistic psychology, and especially the Esalen Institute, became kind of swept into sort of late Cold War diplomacy. So that hopefully will come out in a journal called Emotions and Society at some point. And so you can check it out, and I'll happily send it out if anyone is interested. You can just write me an email. This has been great. Thank you so much for your generous comments. Really, some really good ones, ones that I don't have great answers to, but I think that the sort of generosity of the conversation I've just really appreciated.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we're heading toward the end of this conference. So unless there is one last burning comment, I think we will close it here. So, well, please, okay, yes, let's thank Tomas Matza for this fantastic talk and conversation. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.